I'm Tom Griffiths, Professor of Psychology and Computer Science at Princeton University. I'm going to be talking about joint work with Falk Leader and Fred Callaway. The question of how we should make rational use of our mental effort is really a special case of the more general question of how we should use our computational resources. This is a question that's relevant not just to people, but also to machines. In fact, to any finite agent that has access to limited amounts of computation or limited time. When we're asking questions about how to make a rational use of a resource, we're really asking questions about rational decision-making. And the way that we standardly think about rational decision-making is in terms of something like expected utility theory, which says that what we should do is take the action that has the highest expected utility. But expected utility theory doesn't have in it anything about the computations that go into selecting those actions, or the costs that are invoked by those computations. And so in order to do a better job of accounting for how people might use their computational resources, we need to use a different notion of rationality, what's called meta-level rationality. The idea behind meta-level rationality is that rather than focusing on taking the action that has highest expected utility, we should be thinking about the strategy that best trades off that utility with the underlying computational cost. The way that this is formalized is in terms of doing a maximization over policies or strategies or algorithms, here denoted pi, where that policy, strategy, or algorithm tells us what computations to execute, C, in order to yield beliefs, B, on which we end up making the decision about which action to execute. In this way of formulating things, rather than focusing on doing the right thing, that is, on choosing the action, which maximizes expected utility, we focus on doing the right thinking, that is, choosing the strategy, which is going to result in the sequence of computations that give us the best information on which to base the action that we choose. This notion of meta-level rationality is arguably a better notion of rationality for cognitive psychology. The classical notion of rationality, based on expected utility, focuses on the actions that an agent takes in the external world. You can kind of think about this as being a behaviorist theory of rational behavior. Whereas meta-level rationality focuses on the computations that are executed in the head of the agent in order to determine what the best action to take might be. This approach is something which then allows us to answer the questions that we have as cognitive psychologists about what it is that people should be doing inside their heads, what kinds of thoughts they should be entertaining, what kinds of strategies they should be following, and how it is they should be allocating their mental effort. This way of thinking about things contrasts with a more traditional approach to cognitive modeling, where we might try and build a cognitive process model by first thinking about the components that we're going to put together, various aspects of memory, attention, and so on, in order to then yield something which ends up being our cognitive model. The way that this is standardly done in psychology is by the theorist thinking hard about how those pieces might go together, doing some experiments, being guided by the experimental results, to end up, at the end of a circuitous path, with something that's a hypothesis about what the psychological processes might be. Following the approach that I've been outlining in terms of using meta-level rationality to characterize what rational cognitive processes might look like, results in something that we call a rational process model, where we replace that convoluted process from the theorist with a process of optimization. So the idea here is that if we can specify what the basic computations are that the agent can execute and the problem that the agent is trying to solve, we can use that criterion of meta-level rationality to identify exactly what the best strategy for doing that might be. That is, how the agent should allocate its mental effort to best solve the problem it's trying to solve. In general, executing that optimization might be challenging, but in many cases, there's a way that we can formulate this that makes it more straightforward to derive what those optimal strategies look like. The key idea here is recognizing that the problem of choosing a cognitive strategy to follow is something that we can describe as a sequential decision problem, where rather than making a sequence of decisions where we're going to be taking actions in the world, we're making a sequence of decisions about the computations that we're going to execute. And so the idea here is that we're really taking this optimization problem and thinking about it in terms of the sequence of computations we're going to execute, where for each of those computations, we're making a decision about what the next computation might be based on the sequence of computations executed so far. Expressing things in this way allows us to formulate the problem of deriving optimal strategies in terms of what's called a meta-level Markov decision process. So a Markov decision process is a standard model that's used in reinforcement learning as a way of describing how a rational agent should take actions in the world. In the standard Markov decision process, we imagine a world where there's a sequence of states, where the agent is able to take different actions in each of those states. Those actions result in rewards, and also result in a transition to a new state of the world. In a meta-level Markov decision process, rather than the states corresponding to external states of the world, those states now characterize the beliefs of the agent. And rather than the actions being actions taken in that external world, those actions are now computations that are being executed. As a result, we end up with the agent having a meta-level reward, which could be a computational cost for executing that computation. And then the agent moves to a new belief state. And then at the end of this process of thinking about what to do and generating new belief states, the agent can execute a special action which says, stop thinking, take the best action based on the current beliefs, and then receives the reward which is provided by that action in the world. This framework of meta-level Markov decision processes allows us to automatically derive optimal strategies in a range of cognitive problems. I'm going to show you two examples today, one focused on decision-making and the other planning. And these were selected to be really compelling examples of how it is that we can take some of the classic problems of cognitive psychology and turn them into something which we can now express within this kind of framework. One reason to focus on decision-making is that it's an area where there's been a lot of controversy about the kinds of strategies that people might follow. The dominant view in the field being that people follow heuristics that allow them to efficiently trade off computational cost and error. Expressing heuristics in those terms makes it clear that we can use this framework of meta-level rationality to derive heuristic strategies that people might end up following, and to relate those strategies back to a broader notion of rational behavior that gives us some overarching principles for identifying how it is and why it is that people do the things that they do. The problem that I'm going to focus on here is a problem of multi-alternative risky choice, and in particular something called the mouse lab paradigm, which has been used to explore the strategies that people pursue in these multi-alternative risky choice problems. In this problem, people have to choose between a set of gambles. Each of those gambles is associated with a set of outcomes, and those outcomes have the same probability under those different gambles, but they differ in the payoffs. However, the payoffs associated with each of those outcomes for each of the gambles are unknown, and you need to gather information in order to be able to make a decision. The way that you do that in this case is by clicking on one of these question marks to reveal the value which is associated with that outcome under that gamble. This is a proxy for gathering information about the outcomes that are involved in particular choices, and allows us to look at the strategies that people use for information gathering when they're making decisions. We can formulate this kind of problem in terms of a meta-level Markov decision process, where here the beliefs correspond to the values of those payoffs, basically the information which has been revealed in that array. The actions correspond to evaluating a cell within that array, and the costs are the costs that are associated with gathering that piece of information, either an explicit cost or a cost in terms of the opportunity cost that's involved in pursuing that extra piece of time that's involved in gathering the information. At the end of this process, the agent's able to take an action, in this case selecting a particular gamble, and receives a reward, which is the payoff that is yielded by that particular gamble. Using this framework, we can then derive what the optimal strategies are under different circumstances. And when we do that, one thing that we do is actually rediscover some of the classic strategies that psychologists have come up with when they've looked at behavior in this task. So for example, a strategy called take the best is the optimal solution for non-compensatory low-stakes problems. So in the take the best strategy, what you do is basically go across a row and you focus on the row which has highest probability, and then you choose the gamble which has the highest payoff. This works well in problems which have this non-compensatory structure, which means that one of these probabilities dominates the other probabilities, and where stakes are relatively low, meaning that you don't need to gather all of the information from the array. However, one of the advantages of taking this approach is that it's also possible for us to discover new strategies that haven't been found in the psychological literature before. So using that traditional cognitive modeling approach, we're limited to the kinds of things that the psychologist can imagine, whereas when we derive these strategies automatically, we're able to explore a much wider space and to come up with things that psychologists may not have anticipated. So for example, if we make a small tweak to the structure of this problem, and now we make it a compensatory low-stakes problem, that is, one where there's no longer one probability that dominates the others, then what we find is the optimal strategy is something which combines take the best with satisficing. So what you do here is still focus on the row that has the highest probability, but now as you go across this row, if you hit a payoff that has sufficiently high value, then you're ready to take an action. And so it turns out that people actually follow this strategy in precisely these circumstances, and it's something that hadn't been previously identified. So formulating this problem in terms of meta-level Markov decision processes allows us to reveal kinds of strategies that we hadn't been able to identify before. We can pursue the same kind of approach in another classic cognitive psychology problem, the problem of planning. Here, again, there's been extensive research on the kinds of strategies that people use, informed by both computer science and psychology. In this case, the way that we investigate this is by using a task which is inspired by the mouse lab task, but extends it to sequential decisions. So here, the participant has to guide an agent, here depicted by a spider, along a path and receives a payoff which corresponds to the values that are revealed along that path. However, like in the mouse lab case, those payoffs are concealed, and the participant has to click on the nodes in order to reveal their values. Again, we can express this as a meta-level Markov decision process, where now the beliefs correspond to the revealed values of those different nodes in the paths. The costs are the costs involved in revealing a piece of information, and then the actions are revealing an individual node. And at the end, when they take the action, then they get the payoff, which is the sum of the values along those nodes. When we derive the optimal strategy in this setting, we find that it actually provides a better account of human behavior than any of the classic algorithms that have been investigated in psychology and computer science. In particular, when we look at the human behavior, we see that people are adaptive in the way that they execute their search. So here we're plotting the probability that people choose to terminate their search as a function of the best expected path value discovered so far and the number of clicks that have been made. And so what this demonstrates is that as you move from the bottom left corner to the top right corner, you see this kind of adaptive response where the probability that people terminate increases with fewer clicks as expected path value increases. That is, if people have already found a pretty good path, then they stop exploring in a way that makes sense within the structure of this kind of problem. This kind of adaptive search is something that we see in people and we see in the optimal model, but we don't see in standard kinds of search models. And so it's this capacity to be adaptive in this way that allows the optimal model to do a better job of capturing the human behavior. Meta-level Markov decision processes give us a powerful tool for deriving process models and for answering the question of how it is that people should allocate their effort. I think about this as really a new way that we can go about answering classic questions that come up in cognitive psychology. For example, applying this approach in the context of memory, we can answer questions like how we should chunk information or what kinds of rehearsal strategies we should pursue. Applying it in the context of problem solving, we can look at whether people anticipate the time and error trade-off for different kinds of strategies. Or applying it in the context of intuitive physics, we can answer questions like whether people run the appropriate number of mental simulations. Using this kind of approach allows us to take these classic questions and turn them into something which we can derive optimal solutions to using the methods that come from computer science and reinforcement learning. Thank you.